Hey, Inspired Moneymaker. Today we're talking TV and filmmaking with industry luminaries like Martin Scorsese, Sidney Lumet, and Robert Altman. Oh, and we're going to talk about money too. Let's go! Episode 251 features Michael Cerenzie, film producer, CEO of the Stratagem Group.
So in Hollywood, there's two reasons why people invest. It's very simple, and why an investor will get behind, say, a project. One is if you have a historical record of always making financial returns with a heavy, ROI, in all your numbers that represent that. The second one, which is lucky for a guy like me when I started out, I became the second one, but the first one is they believe in betting on future stock.
I'm Andy Wong, host of the Inspired Money podcast and financial advisor at Runnymede Capital Management. This episode is brought to you by Yachty.com. My friend Everald Reed launched Yachty to showcase Jamaica's best products and local vendors. With just a couple mouse clicks, I can treat myself to authentic Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee. We love it at our house. It's balanced, full-bodied, but without the bitterness. I also love the breadfruit chips and natural bar soaps. It's great knowing that every purchase at Yachty.com directly supports local Jamaican small businesses. You've got to try Blue Mountain Coffee for yourself. Go to Yachty.com, that's YAAHDY.com, and make sure to use coupon code MONEY for 10% off your entire order. Try it and let me know what you think. Now on to the show. Our guest is Michael, who has developed, produced, and financed dozens of films. He's collaborated with iconic filmmakers and an extensive list of Academy Award-winning and nominated actors. In his career, Michael has raised over $900 million, focused on media, tech, entertainment, and real estate development companies. You're going to hear about Stratagem Studios, a brand new 250,000 square foot studio and production facility in Toronto, where productions including Marvel's Hawkeye, Paramount Network's Mayor of Kingstown, and Philip Noyce's The Desperate Hour, starring Academy Award nominee Naomi Watts, were filmed. In this episode, you'll learn about how producers bring together the art of creating a film and getting the money to make projects happen, sources of financing for a film project, and make sure you stay tuned to the end to hear me be surprised by the true motivation behind Stratagem Studios. I don't like being surprised, so stay tuned. Now let's get inspired with Michael Cerenzie. Michael, welcome to Inspired Money. I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Thanks, Andy. Great to be here.
Let's jump right in. What's your earliest childhood memory of money?
That's an interesting question. My earliest impression was we didn't have a lot growing up. I came from a great set of parents up in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, which is in northern Ontario. But we were probably lower middle class. I think that was a nice way to say it. We really didn't have a lot. So my impression was what you couldn't do if you didn't have money, because I think that became obvious to me as a child. And where I took it, though, where I took those feelings, was how you could be creative of not having, say, as much as the next person and still having a great time as a kid and doing things that, still were a lot of fun and enjoyment. So, but it did leave an impression on me at a young age that it mattered.
Any examples of how you could creatively make the dollar go further?
Well, there were two ways. There were several ways, but, one way was, looking at, what toys the other kids had and simplifying those toys into, a stick instead of a laser gun. Do you know what I mean? And having the creativity in your mind to imagine that you still could find the same joy, I guess. The magical thing about kids is that they have an imagination that's believable, right? And I think that for me, that was an imprinted piece that my mother gave me, because we couldn't afford to travel. I'll give you a short story. We couldn't afford to travel. So one summer, my mother asked me where I wanted to go. And I said, I want to go to Paris. because my first language is French. And so I went to bed that night and I woke up the next morning and my mother had stayed up all night and sewn a little French sailor's outfit with a beret and put it on the end of my bed. And I went down and there was Edith Piaf playing. Of course, I didn't know who Edith Piaf was at the time. And there was like, hot chocolate that was supposed to be your cappuccino or your cafe au lait. And she'd made chocolate croissants. And we spent the day painting a painting of Le Seine, right, in the Champs-Élysées and the Arc de Triomphe. And then we sold our paintings instead of having a Kool-Aid stand on the street. So it becomes a market position, right? Instead of selling Kool-Aid, we sold our paintings to the tourists on the street. And, and then at the end of the day, we took the money from selling our paintings and we went to a nice restaurant. And if you had asked me probably for years afterwards, I would have told you I really went to Paris that weekend in August in Sault Ste. Marie. So that's where I tie in the imagination part of it, right? And the creativity of it.
That is so very cool.
Yeah.
Today, you're an award-winning film producer, a financier, a serial entrepreneur. Your career is so multifaceted. As a child, could you even have begun to envision what you're doing today?
So I did. I was a dreamer. We had a television in the basement at the time, and I grew up on the films of Martin Scorsese, and Sidney Lumet and Francis Ford Coppola. And I was mesmerized and kind of transported by those worlds, right? So it was something from a very young age that I felt pulled and attracted to. But I don't think any of that would have prepared me for the journey that I went on. I think what created the journey that I went on was the idea to get to New York City and to find my way into that world somehow. That was kind of what drove me out of, I guess, where I grew up to Toronto, then eventually to New York City at a young age.
And what did that look like? You came to New York in hopes of becoming an actor?
I thought I was going to be the next Marlon Brando, Robert De Niro, Al Pacino. I'm a pretty in-depth research person at the time. The internet wasn't what it is today. This is like late 80s. So I had found this acting teacher who was a master acting teacher named William Esper, who had studied with Sanford Meisner, which was part of the original group theater. And I contacted him and I auditioned along with 5,000 some odd boys and girls from around the world for 24 slots in his acting class. So it was very, it was a high bar audition process. And I went to New York on a train to audition for there. And I was accepted into his acting program. So it started out as an artist, as an actor in New York City.
So at that time, the plan was going along in alignment with your dream.
It was,
but you took a turn toward producing. What did that look like?
It happened right away. I'd been in New York less than a week and a half in 91, the fall of 91. And I was in a conversation with Bill after an acting class, and I found out that he was on the board of this other theater company called the Ensemble Studio Theater. And it was one of the original off-Broadway theaters that exploded in the mid-'60s, early '70s, which was a response basically to the over-commercialization of Broadway at the time. And so there was a gentleman named Kurt Dempster, who was the artistic director there. And I got Bill to request a sponsorship for me to go over there. And I started as a unpaid intern, painting sets and cleaning the toilets and, answering the phone and, working as an usher. And within 6 months to 9 months of my first year there, I became the associate producer director of their theater. And then the next year, I produced with Kevin Confoy the Marathon of One-Act Plays, which we won an Obie Award for. So within 2 years of being, or less than a year and a half of being in New York, we won that Obie Award. And I think that was a very integral moment for me in the understanding that I wasn't probably an actor. I was more of a producer. But what really sheds light, I think, on that component was we were producing a benefit for Arthur Miller. And Arthur was being awarded, a Lifetime Achievement Award. And Dustin Hoffman, of course, was doing the introduction speech for him because they had done Death of a Salesman on Broadway. And we were in the wings of the theater, and he turned to me because I had worked with Arthur on one of his plays that he was doing, called The Last Yankee. And he said, you know, kid, you're not an actor, you're a producer. And if I didn't have a great producer in Bob Whitehead, nobody would ever have known my plays. Nobody would ever have known my film, and nobody would have ever known me. And I think spending that time at the theater, and then that moment, you know, there's moments in our lives that I think impact us. I think Arthur Miller took me for a ride that day, right? And it was pretty much afterwards. I finished my second year, but then I was on a train out to Los Angeles 3 months later, you know, and I didn't look back.
Wow. What a moment of clarity.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's funny. I've never told that story before. I just realized I don't really share that story. It was such a very personal, impactful moment. And at first I was insulted because I wanted to be an actor in one of his plays, right? I thought, oh, you know, Arthur's going to put me in a play and I'm going to become, you know, the next Dustin Hoffman, back to what motivated me originally. But what I gravitated towards was how important he thought the role of the producer was, even in his career, right? Because I think what we miss in producing, I think there's a misinterpretation of what a producer does. I think a lot of people think it's finance. And there's of course, there's definitively a financial component that comes along in it, but it's the idea that you're taking something in a very raw state. It could be an original idea, or it could be something, it could be a Vanity Fair article. It could be, you know, an 18th century poem that you're adapting an idea from, but it's a raw state. And then you're taking that on a very long creative journey for it to develop with other people creatively that you have to share a vision with, right? And you're bringing the filmmaker on and a writer on, and you're bringing actors on, and there's all these components that go into that really truly emerge before you get to view it in the theater, or today, say, on a streaming, you know, platform of some sort, right? So yeah, it's I love it because it's cooperative. There's an alchemy that is created in it that is somewhat hard to describe in a magical state, but yet it's a very serious business at the same time, right? There's a very specific financial modeling aspect that includes the distribution of a component of that has to be taken into effect if you're going to make it a real business and not just an artistic endeavor.
You've developed, produced, and financed dozens of films independently and in partnership with major Hollywood studios. You talked about growing up to movies, and I know that Before the Devil Knows You're Dead is a big one.
Definitely.
Directed by legendary Academy Award-winning filmmaker Sidney Lumet, who you mentioned as like an influence on you as a kid. What are some of the personal highlights for you?
On Devil with Sidney, or in general?
Just any of these projects. I mean, I can't, like, what did it feel like to work on a project with Sidney Lumet?
You actually asked me a great question, and I interrupted you. I'm going to answer it this way. My first film, actually, which that still photography is from, the photos from, is Deuces Wild. And so my first film was a $10 million project at MGM, United Artists. And Martin Scorsese was my executive producer on my first film. And it was a 50s gang film that was in the vein of a lot of the films I had grown up with, right? That, you know, he had done Mean Streets, and Coppola had done some great films. And so for me, I think the pursuit of that idea, so I can answer you correctly, was I wanted to work with the people that I grew up with watching those shows in my basement. And you could say it's very dreamlike, but that was the pursuit. And working with Marty as an executive producer on my first film was amazing because of, you know, he was doing Gangs of New York at the time at Chiachita. So, you know, like you're doing note sessions with, you know, and, you know, he had his hands full directing, you know, a major film with Leo DiCaprio. I think where I went from that first film that migrated into the Lumet picture was I developed Before the Devil Knows You're Dead, and I always saw him as the filmmaker, right? And it's about understanding the material, I think, and understanding the filmmaker's vision. And so the pursuit was, I'm a very specific cat. I only saw him directing it, which is problematic, by the way, when you're making a film. If there's only one director on your list and not five, right, with options of another five if they're not available or if they pass on your script. Luckily, I got it to him personally, and he accepted the script. Working with Sidney was probably the greatest experience of my life. He was the kindest, gentlest, most creative being I've ever met. And here's a kind of exemplar to that point. When you're on a movie set, typically there's these high back chairs that have the star's name on them and the director's names on them, right, and the producer's names on them. On a Lumet set, you don't have that. And you have no big high back chairs. You basically just have a bunch of folding chairs that are by the camera where the high back chairs are supposed to be. It's kind of a great lens into his mind and his way he looked at things. He didn't look at things like, you have a lot of directors who are known for their tempers, right? Sidney was known as one of the greatest actor-directors of all time. And he rehearsed his play. He also rehearsed his films like they were plays, right? He came from the theater, just to give you a background. So he was much more kind of, and he was an actor, he was a child actor. So his whole approach to the film set was more collaborative and creative, and it stayed with me my entire life.
You described this as dreamy, from going to your basement to working with people who are at the highest level of the industry. How do you make that happen?
Tenacity, focus, and the ability to endure the journey that you're going on. So I think the clearest way for me to really explain that is what I sought originally in New York was to test my mettle against the best in the world, right? So it didn't matter. So even the audition process I explained to you about Bill Esper, right? So that was really the first encounter. But you spend a lot of time in Manhattan, I'm sure, and people, whether you're in the financial industry or the music industry or the creative industries of any sort, come from all around the world. They just don't migrate, out of Manhattan proper or from the boroughs, as you know. So the idea to be able to see where you need to be, to test yourself, right? To understand. The dreamy component of it is I looked at the filmmakers that I grew up with and had the impact on me as a child. I was lucky that most of them were still alive, in my creative expression, my time when I started out. I also had the opportunity to work with Robert Altman, who was also one of the big influences in my life as a young boy. Unfortunately, Bob passed away when we were still in pre-production on our film. But I believe that it's not any more demanding of yourself to go for the highest, maybe most important form of what you're seeking. It doesn't take any more effort, I don't believe. And I believe that few of us actually do pursue to the level that we are available to deliver. You know what I mean? I think we become accustomed with a different level, and we cap ourselves out too soon, right? So I think the influences of my mother, by the way, growing up, the dreaming aspect of the going on the Parisian trip, from Sault Ste. Marie, never leaving Sault Ste. Marie, also affects the lens of which I create from, and the idea that people do want to be involved in creative vision. And if you have the creative foresight to understand the people that you want to work with, whether that's a Sidney Lumet or a Martin Scorsese or Robert Altman, I believe that those types of creative geniuses feel both unified and comfort in that understanding, right? Where that impacts film, art, and finance is interesting, right? Because you have to look at, there's another union going on at the same time where the creativity and the creation of that creates a monetization so that the investment of a community, whether it's private equity or institutional funding, then says, we get that. You know what I mean? So then there's a whole other component that has to come into the creation to get there, by the way. So it's not that easy to get, hey, get this person on board, say, to direct with you, direct a film for you, or come on and produce creatively with you. The same reasons, or there could be a functionality in the thinking of that also attracts the investment component. And I know that sounds a little abstract, but to me, it's always been that way. Creativity of any sort creates a byproduct. And that product, depending how well you've designed it, is the reason why people will invest in that with you. And it's a vehicle for everyone to go on, right? The reasons for them to do it could be totally different. And you can't get too heady on why this person's on board or this person's on board. What's critical to the thinking of a creative producer, who I also finance, is that there's a clear message in here that anyone could understand from their lens point, so that they're coming on the same vision, right? Because where you get in trouble is if you and your creative director are working this way and your investment is looking for this out of it, then you have the wrong type of money at the table, right? So to me, it's been always critical to have a lens. I know you didn't ask me this, but it's actually really important. You have to have a very critical lens of what money you're bringing to the table for the type of project that you're doing, whether that's a film project, whether that's infrastructure, whether it's a new vertical in a company that we're launching. I care about the intention of the money. I care about the cohesive manner in which it fits with the other elements that I brought together to make that happen.
I'm so curious about this intersection of film, art, and finance, because I think when it comes to like creative endeavors, so often many people just look at them very separately. And there are preconceived notions also about a starving artist and people being passionate about their art and not caring about the money. But as a producer, you have to be very practical and realistic. One cannot exist without the other. You need to bring them together. So talk a little bit more about bringing the right money to the table.
So what you just said was so spot on. Okay, so everyone looks at a producer as being like at the top of a food chain of sorts, right? If you have a pyramid structure that they're in creative control and say financial control. We'll say they're also in financial control as an independent feature, okay, for this concept. But I've always looked at this pyramid kind of being inverted, right? Where the producer's actually here, because you have to support everyone's creative vision and expectation. And then at the same point, you have to protect those that are coming in from a financial investment into that structure as well, right? So I'll say you have to have big shoulders and you have a heavy obligation on you. The way that I see that intersection or communion taking place differs depending on what the project is. If we're talking about a film project, I'm usually looking for something very simple, whether it's equity. I'm talking about the equity component because the debt component really is different. It's usually an institutional debt component. So typically I'm looking for a private equity investor. It could be a fund or it could be just an individual, high net worth individual in often cases in our business. And what you're looking for is almost, and I know this is going to sound a little, maybe hard to comprehend, almost an exact understanding of what we're doing and why. And in the sense that if we're saying, okay, we're going to make a 1950s film that's reminiscent of the films from Marty and Francis in this vein, what are the things that you could put into those components that would express that narrative, right? It's a narrative. It's a story, right? So the story in the case of, say, Dukes is Wild was it's MGM United Artists, and United Artists was the producer, like the studio, right, that produced and distributed some of the most classic films of the 1970s and 1980s, which included some of Marty's first films, right? You had Raging Bull, you had, so you're creating a linear tie, like it's a tethered position. So if Marty's now executive producing this film and United Artists is actually financing this film alongside Michael Cerenzie and also distributing this film, then you're creating a very interesting narrative that people understand if you're going to, say, private equity in New York, which I raised my capital out of New York on that film. And it's about New York, right? It's about Brooklyn, Sunset Park, 1957. So there's things in that era that were also probably similar to the ages of the people that were investing in the film. So I look for, I know it seems like a lot of work, right? But I look for these very specific structures that underpin what I want to get done so that people feel that this is their journey as well. And you could say, well, Michael, it's just an investment. You know as well as I do the way people invest, right? They can invest because they think you have a great quant algorithm, or they can usually invest because they're saying this person's reputation is such and his track record is XYZ. So in Hollywood, there's two reasons why people invest. It's very simple, and why an investor will get behind, say, a project. One is if you have a historical record of always making financial returns with a heavy, ROI, in all your numbers that represent that. The second one, which is lucky for a guy like me when I started out, I became the second one, but the first one is they believe in betting on future stock. And a future stock play is the potentiality that you have within, say, the story, the screenplay. And I'll say that the director and the actors do monetize, you know what I'm saying, the investment. So it's not just about saying, here's a great story that we could relate to that maybe we want to see on the screen again, so our kids could watch the films that we were growing up in Brooklyn, in 57 or something. It's more about, do we also have a monetized player? So if you had someone like Martin Scorsese into that idea, you have a more financially sound instrument, right? If you add United Artists into that, you have a financially sound, sound instrument. I added, actors from an actor perspective. You were looking for people that had a creative representation of that type of film as well. So all of those things together resonate when you walk into a room and you're sitting across the table from somebody. I didn't pursue institutional money in the beginning because I felt I was a little too maverick, to be honest with you, and I was too into my own strategy of wanting to get a slate of pictures up, to be very honest. I've never made films that everyone else was making. Like, in other words, I'm not making Marvel type action films right now. Do you know what I mean? That's not my bailiwick. So let's say if everyone was doing Westerns, that's not what I do. I always wanted to make the type of film that I thought had a value in the community, that shed a component of human existence or human light on a component of humanity that was interesting for you to go and witness, whether on a streaming line, or in a movie theater. Does that answer it? I don't know if I...
Was that a correct or incorrect assumption at that time, not to go after institutional money as a maverick?
I think it was definitely a correct assumption. Institutional money in the film business works the same as it does in any other industry. It doesn't take big chances. It needs a track record performance for it to get involved. But I also believe that there's flexibility and fluidity in private equity in the capital that I raised and who I raised it with, that gave autonomy to the creative process that I wanted to present, right? So when you're starting out in any creative endeavor, you want to ensure that there's a bit of a firewall there for you creatively, so that you have the chance to create an expression, a thumbprint, to establish yourself, so that you then could, the larger money will pursue you. If you're successful at what you're doing, the larger money will find you. You don't have to work hard to do that, actually. The hard part is establishing
who you are and what you are in a market that could capture the market that you're in.
So it sounds like the hardest time is getting started when you don't have that track record. As you build your experience, if you're doing great work, you'll begin to attract money. It gets easier.
It does. I mean, when we started the group of companies up here in Toronto originally, with the Stratagem Group, it was no different, right? I had never been someone who was known for building infrastructure in the entertainment business. I was never someone who's known for creating verticals within a product line. It's like a manufacturing product line when you make film or television, right? There's all these different development aspects. There's creative, there's financial, there's development, there's production. There's physical production, there's infrastructure, then you have other verticals in workforce, training, labor, post-production. There's a myriad, right? So it's no different when we created this business, when I founded this with Michelle Lopsack, my founding partner here. The idea was simply that I was up here on a visit, visiting my mother at the time. I'd been gone 25 years and, I come back to spend time here. And I saw that in Canada and in Toronto specifically, there wasn't the same maturity in the market that was taking place, say, in New York at the time, or Atlanta, or London, or Los Angeles. And given my global perspective of the work that I had done both in Hollywood and in direct investment in Asia and the Middle East, which was it was all infrastructure, it wasn't entertainment based, it was infrastructure based. I said, wow, there's a big opportunity here. There's a moment that's coming. What we couldn't have calculated at that time was COVID and the impact of the growth of streaming, and then streaming with COVID in the competition for eyeballs at home, right? So the combination of you and I and everyone sitting at home and going through everything on Netflix and everything on Amazon, everything that was available at the time, nobody could have calculated that into a strategy. Luckily, we were there ahead of the curve. I don't know if it was luck. I mean, we saw it early and we took the opportunity position. But the growth that came out of that, like riding a wave. The answer specifically to your question in that is we couldn't attract institutional capital in Canada because I had never been in this business, right? It didn't matter how successful I was in Los Angeles at the time or had been overseas. It didn't translate, right, to market maker here, say in an alternative asset class that hadn't been defined yet by, say, the Blackstones with the Hudson Pacifics of the world, or the MBS's Michael Hackman, and the aggregation of that strategy. So at the time, the Schedule I banks in Canada, which dominate your institutional finance in the beginning, before, say, the pensions come in, and most of the pensions, as you probably know, are investing globally to get a higher return on average of their investment strategy. So we were kind of like in no man's land at the time. And also we were non-essential construction. So that meant we could get shut down anytime by the government due to COVID protocols, right? So though I think we should have attracted institutional investment, we had to go to high net worth and private equity across the board. And we did that very successfully. And subordinate debt that came behind that, so that we were able to open 250,000 square feet of the top stages that exist in Canada today, as well as we were the only group that did that globally during the pandemic, right? And the success isn't that we opened the stages. And you could say, oh, great, you opened the stages. The success was the first show coming in there was Paramount Network. So Taylor Sheridan, everyone knows Taylor Sheridan from doing Yellowstone and the success of Yellowstone, the TV series with Kevin Costner. After his third season, he was launching his first new series with Jeremy Renner, Paramount Network, and they couldn't get a studio facility that was available anywhere in the United States. They couldn't find certain locations to match what they needed to do some of their location set shooting. And we literally opened our studio 6 months early by staggering half the stages to open later so we could fit their show in so that show could air. Do you know what I mean? And we couldn't have done that without being fluid in our understanding of how do you move from one, say, component of investment, say institutional or say an institutional debt piece that would be more conventional in what you would have been doing, like a senior position in there, and saying, okay, we're going to capitalize it with private equity and some subordinate that we could then roll back out the other side. By taking those risks and that adaptation in the financing model, we then were able to shoot a large part of Hawkeye, the Marvel TV series, because Jeremy then couldn't go to Atlanta because of the COVID protocols between the United States and Canada. We took advantage of that by convincing Marvel to shoot it up here in Toronto. So we shot Marvel at our stages, as well as we shot Toronto for New York. That's part of the creativity from a finance mechanism, but also the verticals within the Stratagem Group allowed that creativity to take place so that, say, a big Hollywood studio like Marvel, who never shot ever in Canada, because there weren't the stages they needed and there wasn't the production service company that worked together with that, felt safe enough to take a chance on us. And then they shot more with us after that. They did another series with us as well, right? So I look at finance in this example of what you were asking me, that it impacts directly the creative, success that's generated out of those choice making.
So would you say that you were a beneficiary of this crazy pandemic time, given the timing, that you were able to open your production stage? It sounds like you were among the first, and maybe there was a period where you were the only place open for filming and production.
Canada had great protocols put in place. So to answer your question, we were a big answer in the first year, right? For the first year of the pandemic, we became a very safe, secure place to shoot. And the reasons for that are also, what's great about the conservatism of our industry here and how we protected it is that the high level of insurance that you need on a show, the actors for testing and so forth. You can imagine, right? If your actor gets sick and goes down, or someone in the crew infects your actor or vice versa, you're talking about millions and millions of dollars that are, in liability, right? Now, the major studios self-insure, the independents don't, just, to give some specific position on that. So either you're carrying a very big insurance policy, right, that is costing you millions of dollars on top of the millions of dollars that already cost you to produce that show, or you're inherently absorbing it in your strategy, if you're a studio. But we took advantage of it. It only looks good now, by the way. I think it looks better now. I think we were very concerned for 24 months or 26 months. I think that my experience in Los Angeles in finance helped us tremendous as a company, because movies fall apart all the time, right? Your private equity drops out, your senior drops out, your subordinate there's a rotational aspect of financing that happens that you grow up in entrepreneurially. So I think the entrepreneurial component that I grew up in film financing in Los Angeles aided to my thinking ahead, and I'll say down the street and around the corner, of what could potentially go wrong, because we had those. So we had backup, we backed ourselves up where we were oversubscribed from a capital standpoint, so that if we did lose an investor or two along the way because they were getting hurt in, say, other market investment, their money's tied to other investments, in market, we would still be able to absorb that shock and complete what we did. To say we took advantage of it, I think we did. I think so consciously, as the CEO and the founder, we had a meeting on March 8th or 9th, almost 2.5 years ago. And there was a big worry in the company. We're a new company. We're a group of new companies. We're just like 24 months, 36 months old. And I sat down with everyone and I said, okay, we're not laying off anybody. We went into a growth strategy. So our idea, was to grow exponentially, no matter how long COVID persisted within our community in the world. And that idea came from the way I looked at other markets that I'd been involved with earlier. And then I said that, most people are going to, lay off, and there's going to be some fear going on in the business, right? And I said, we need to actually we ended up doing 250% more than we thought we were in our growth strategy for the last 24 months because of that. So we doubled down and tripled down in the bet. Yeah.
It's a heck of a start with Taylor Sheridan on board, with Marvel's Hawkeye. What does the pipeline look like today? Was that start has that inspired others to look at Canada where they hadn't previously?
So there's definitely a migration in Canada right now to a lot of big private equity firms out of Manhattan. There's been TPG had a big acquisition up here in Chicago in Cinespace for $1.1 billion. There's an unofficial Pinewood RFP that's floating around. It was in the Hollywood Reporter a few weeks ago. There was a leak on that. What we have found personally to answer that is we're 100% booked. Our stages are 100% booked with a show from Showtime right now that took all 250,000 square feet of our stages and support. So personally, we've seen the benefit of pulling off, Hawkeye and Taylor's first season of Mayor of Kingstown. In the growth of what we're looking at for Q1 next year, we have 4 different Hollywood studios, 3 studios and 1 streaming company that are all looking to take us off market, so take 100% of the stages on a multi-year basis. So to answer your question, that's fantastic. Where we've taken the opportunity is we're developing another 17 acres here in Toronto in the west end of the city. And we have just now securing one of the largest, studio streaming companies to come in and do a very long-term lease, like a 15-year covenant with us, which would be the first one of the kind in North America. So that's not even been done in the US, by the way. So part of what we established, to answer your question specifically, in our first year, our inaugural year, has laid to the benefit of the second year beyond at the Stratagem Studios. But now what we're doing in Toronto, we're going to probably end up mimicking this in Los Angeles and in New York and in London.
Michael, this idea of doubling down, tripling down in the face of a pandemic, this was probably one of the biggest unknowns and lack of visibility as a business leader. How scary was that at that time?
I was a film producer for 25 years. I've been working without a net for a long time, is what I'm going to say. I think what made this venture and group of companies and those decisions scarier was the responsibility of my partners, my executives, and my leadership teams, and all my employees, including all the interns, right? So what happens when you're gambling on your own, you could play high stakes, hold'em, no limit, as much as you want. The difference that I felt from a stress point on this was everyone has kids, there's school, there's dental bills, there's mortgages involved, car payments, and I think the sobriety of that thinking, literally the lens I had on that was a hard lens that, we couldn't fail. So the risk-taking decision-making was easy for me because it's habitual and it's calculated, right? I think what was different this time was the downside effect of what could happen if we fail, right? So I have great partners and great leadership who raise the bar with me every day through it. I can't say enough about my partners and the leaderships that we have in this company. I think they're the best in the world. I think they're the best I've ever worked with. I told them the other day, we were talking about Before the Devil Knows You're Dead with Sidney, and Philip Seymour Hoffman was in that, and Albert Finney and Marissa Tomei and Ethan Hawke. It was and the crew was amazing. All of them were multi-Academy Award-winning editors and DOPs. And, it was just it's Sidney, right? So he carried that with him. I've told my team for the last 2 years it was the best team I've ever worked with. So I think where the risk comes into a calculus that it's hard to quantify is the creative variables of those people, right? And what they brought into the company so that I could assume those risks was based on them as well, right? So I didn't just bet on the concepts and the vision of the business that we were creating. I was betting on the person and the people that sat around the table. And I just saw that they had the ability to carry it. And they did.
When it comes to managing risk, how granular do you get thinking about worst case scenario or plan B, plan C?
It's not really granular for me, to be very honest. It's more, I need 5 backups. So it is A, B, C, D, might go into E and F sometimes, right? Because depending on the level of risk that you're talking about, I think if you don't have that thinking, then you're risking actually, you're over your skis, right? And I don't like being over my skis. You know what I'm saying? So I have to take into effect in my thinking truly, what we need. So I'll explain it this way. When we were doing film, you'd always have other private equity to back up your private equity and other senior debt components to back up your senior debt leader in the deal in case, somebody knee-jerked or the market changed or something transpired. I've always believed that you need fluidity, a lot of fluidity in finance. I don't care what kind of venture. When we went into this was an asset class, of real estate that nobody even believed it was an asset class. And now if you talk about everyone calls it an asset class. When we first went around with this to the banks, they didn't understand what we're talking about. I think from a Canadian perspective, the Schedule I banks needed the Blackstones of the world, right? Needed the large private equity and institutional players globally to say, this is an asset class. And once you say, establish this, then the rest could follow. But by the time, you know how this works, by the time you would wait for that to happen, you wouldn't need the capital anymore, right? So that's why I've always believed that fluidity is needed in this kind of, growth strategy.
So with the success, you've created many jobs, and you've created this value of real estate and demand in your home of Canada. How does that feel?
Well, it feels amazing. I mean, the real reason for creating the group of companies was education and skills training. We weren't going to get into infrastructure. We got into infrastructure because it was the only way that we could actually create the type of employment strategy and opportunity that we wanted to with our educational program.
I didn't realize that you started with education. I saw that on the website, but I didn't know that that was the starting point.
It was the starting point. It was the first company, right, that me and Michelle created. And we partnered with 22 colleges in Ontario, which was amazing, which was part of what's called HomeAd, which is Heads of Media Arts and Design. So we're partners with all the colleges in Ontario, which is 22. We also have a large strategic position with Toronto District School Board, which has 225,000 students, which is the largest school board in North America. And we also do a lot of strategy with Toronto City Housing, which creates jobs in that sector as well. So just to give you some basic math, we found out very early in our analysis that for every 100,000 square feet of stage facility that we open, we create somewhere between 1,200 and 1,600 full-time equivalent jobs on site. And what's strategic about what we did in Toronto is we opened in an area called Scarborough, which is an area that nobody was building movie studios in. The only movie studios in Toronto were down at the Portlands on the waterfront, which was Pinewood, and where CineSpace was, which is in the west end of the city. So by creating this, we created localized jobs in a depressed market, which we proved that Hollywood didn't care where it would be. They just wanted to know they had great stages and they had great crews. But there's a bunch of other benefits. So say you create 1,500 jobs in our stages, you'd create another 2,000 to 2,500 jobs offsite in post-production and other components of the vertical that go into that manufacturing pipeline, right? So the long tail benefit is even greater than the direct one that you're creating here. So there's creating thousands of jobs. we're excited. We put 7,000 young people through our, TDSB program during COVID. So 7,000 students that were grade 11s and 12, looking at what they were pursuing in post, secondary education, did our quads, and we're going to increase that to above 10,000 probably next year. So those are the pieces that get me and my partners extremely excited in what we're doing. That was the idea. That was the original thought when I came back here, was how do you take Sidney Lumet, Martin Scorsese, Kurt Dempster, William Esper, and all the people who have, contributed to mentoring me through my, diverse career. How do you translate that so it's not just one or two students I'm personally, say, mentoring on a set or in my corporate offices? How do you take that, translate it into a model where it can become a tool? So I did the analog version, right? So really simple. I went from Sault Ste. Marie to Toronto to New York to LA over 16 years, 17 years. So it was 17 years before I made my first movie. So before everyone gets so excited, your first film was a $10 million movie with, United Artists. That's like the analog, the old school analog version of life. What we do in our education model is it's digitally infused. So in the sense that you do a program, you go home that night, you write it with your friend, or you write it on your own, you shoot it on your phone, you edit it on your computer, and that's out, right? So it's about, you don't have to leave Sault Ste. Marie, the basement that you grew up in. You could do it from Toronto, you could do it from, from Poughkeepsie, you could do it from Seattle, you could do it from Beijing, you could do it from Mumbai. Do you know what I mean? So, because we're globalizing our education platform as well. So that's why, so the idea behind it was, how do we take that? And let's say you don't want to go into post-secondary, you want to go directly into the labor force and be creative. So we do micro-credentials, and we establish that as well. We work a lot with Unity in that design thinking of what we do. So the education really is the backbone. To be honest, it's really the true engine of the company, but it doesn't get as much attention as, some of the other pieces.
Wow, the scalability, the impact. I like to ask all the Inspired Money guests, how do you define success?
I have a very specific answer to that. It's not on the celluloid with your name on the film, or, on a building. It's how the impact, I would say it's the impact that you leave on other people, right? So if it's a good impact, I think you've done well. I think it's that simple for me these days.
With Stratagem Group, to what extent are you motivated by the idea of legacy in what you want to leave behind?
It's the whole reason for creating a company. I think growing up here as a young man, there weren't certain opportunities, right? And the U.S. afforded me amazing opportunities, creatively, and to hone my business skills, and, and to learn a lot of what I did entrepreneurially. I think for me and the company, I would say that my partners feel the same way as this. This is the shared vision we have, right? This is our script, right? The script of the company is basically, how can we leave things better? How can we create more? How do we educate differently so that if you want to take a 3-month program instead of a 3-year program, you can get that 3-month program through us, and you could get on a set and be a hairstylist tomorrow, a makeup artist tomorrow, a lighting designer. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's really about creating opportunity for others to pursue their dreams, and to find a very effective way to make that accessible, right? And that's why we work with all the colleges that we do, and the Toronto District School Board. Like, what we try to do is capture large nets of people, to be honest, and give them a way in which to accelerate themselves, and to maybe help give them some definition and some opportunities that they maybe weren't aware of. because I also believe that's an educational process on its own. Our parents are limited. They're amazing, but they're all limited, right? We're limited, right? So I think creating access into our thinking is critical to find success. So those are the pieces for legacy for me. But to be able to travel globally, right? Like, so there's another component that's in there for me, where the world to me is something that should be explored, right? And so it's like a passport in a sense. You're creating a passport for somebody, because once you understand your pursuits and maybe some more clear steps to get there, that's freedom. And it gives people a chance to do things that typically they weren't maybe thinking it was available to them. Taking out those limitations. Those are my ideas.
Well, thank you for sharing your career with us, your incredible growth story, and the fact that dreams are possible, and perhaps much higher than we may even realize. The world is large. So thank you for sharing your inspired story with us. Tell the Inspired Money listeners and viewers where they can follow you, learn more about your company.
Oh, on any of the Stratagem Group platforms. So on all the social media platforms, Stratagem Group.
I'll put that in the show notes. Thanks so much, Michael. So what was your favorite Inspired Money moment? That was so much fun. Whenever names like Dustin Hoffman, Marissa Tomei, and Philip Seymour Hoffman get mentioned here, it's an exciting day. My favorite Inspired Money moment was subtle. You may have even missed it. In working with Robert Altman and so many legendary filmmakers, Michael said it's not any more demanding on yourself to go for the highest, most important form of what you're seeking. Few of us pursue things at a level that we're capable of. Do not cap yourself too soon. It reminds me of the phrase, shoot for the stars, settle for the moon, the sky's the limit. If you had a different favorite Inspired Money moment, please post a comment or share it in the Inspired Money Makers Facebook group at inspiredmoney.fm/Facebook. Thank you for tuning in to the end. Be sure to subscribe to my email that goes out every 2 weeks. It's investment focused, and the Runnymede investment team highlights data, news, and events that we think are worth sharing. Subscribe at inspiredmoney.fm/newsletter. Thank you for joining me on this mission. Have an inspired week and do something that scares you, because that's where the magic happens.